Chapter 6 on Making Man More Tractable. If America ever falls to totalitarianism, the dictator will be a behavioral scientist and the chief of police will be armed with lobotomy and psychosurgery. Peter R. Breggin, a psychiatrist, in congressional testimony. Perhaps the riots of recent years on the campus, in the ghetto, and against the war in Vietnam gave the movement a push. At any rate, we have been seeing a widespread anxious search for neat ways to control unruly people. The appealing new approach is to handle such people quietly, scientifically. The Russians have been in the lead in using this approach, although often as a sham. They have had doctors examine outspoken dissidents and declare them mentally ill. Then the dissidents were sent off to asylums. The Russians are also reported to have devised a simple technique for permanently enfeebling the brains of dissidents they have detained. A Canadian psychiatrist at the University of British Columbia Medical School testified on this at a hearing before the Subcommittee on Internal Security of the U.S. Senate. He stated that the Soviet police had discovered that the use of massive doses of reserpine caused some atrophy of the brain. His charge, he said, was based on talks with the Soviet psychiatrist of former Soviet residents. Reserpine ordinarily is used to treat hypertension. The yearning for a placid, conforming populace in the U.S. was best articulated by former Vice President Spiro T. Agnew. We're always going to have a certain number of people in our community who have no desire to achieve or have no desire to even fit in an amicable way with the rest of society. And these people should be separated from the community, not only in a callous way, but they should be separated as far as any idea that their opinions shall have any effect on the course we follow. Many managers of institutions that inevitably deal with unruly people seem to judge their success by the degree of orderliness and placidity achieved. I refer particularly to managers of schools, prisons, corporations, homes for the aged, and mental hospitals. Seymour Hallett, a psychiatrist at the University of North Carolina, has observed that many of his colleagues evaluate the success of treating emotionally distressed people by only one criterion, whether it makes the patient more placid. And the psychiatrist H.L. Newbold, cited earlier, seems to feel that taming man by programming him for tractability should be a major objective of psychiatrists. He points out that administering psychochemicals makes the patient more tractable, and thus reprogramming by the therapist is made easier. He calls tractability of pressing interest. Man gets into a lot of trouble, he says, because he is biologically programmed to be expansive or aggressive. Overexpansive children might well be kept on tranquilizers while they are being programmed for life. This enables them to fit more easily into the social norms. A number of people and organizations have been urging that some sort of system for spotting the violence prone be adoption. Certain law enforcement and genetics experts without sufficient warrant have proposed that all newborn male babies be screened for an extra Y chromosome. About 1 in 500 males have the XYY chromosome. The fact that in some surveys, a somewhat higher proportion of XYYs have showed up in prison populations have inspired the scanning proposals. But how significant is seeming variance when you consider that a great many people are in prison for cupidity, not violence? A man who was President Nixon's internist at one point, Arnold A. Puschenecker, proposed that we rid society of violent people by mass screening of 6 to 8-year-olds. Psychological tests would be used. The idea would be to detect those with real or potential tendencies towards violence. Also, he would assign children identified as severely disturbed to camps for special training. According to a report by Charles Witter in Transaction, the social science journal, Huschnecker's proposal was written on White House stationery and was sent to the Secretary of Department of Health, Education, and Welfare for suggestions. And according to the same report, it was studied for 3 months at the National Institute of Mental Health. The House Subcommittee on Privacy got wind of it and discussed holding hearings. Then he responded to the White House unfavorably. Kenneth Keniston, an authority on alienation, has sardonically envisioned that within a decade, Congress would pass a Remote Therapy Center Act. This would set up 247 centers, mostly in the Rocky Mountain area. Each would hold 1,000 patients. Each would treat inner city dwellers identified by train spotters as suffering from aggressive alienation syndrome. The brain surgeon Vernon H. Mark and Frank R. Irvin, a psychiatrist in the controversial book Violence in the Brain, call for an early warning test on violence. They propose to set up a basic standard of behavior on the violence dimension, and individuals with a normal brain can meet. Those who can't, they suggest, could somehow be diagnosed by testing further for malfunction of the limbic system of their brains. Pacifying by brain surgery. Some of the proposals go beyond the mere screening of unruly people. If other techniques for treating them are unproductive, psychosurgery would be the treatment of choice. The psychiatrist Peter R. Breggin, a critic, says of psychosurgery, for the would-be despot, be he politician, prison warden, mental hospital superintendent, law enforcement official, bigot, or simply family tyrant, psychosurgery is a dream come true. In 1967, when rioting in the ghettos was attracting national attention, Irvin and Mark, along with their Harvard colleague William H. Sweet, a brain surgeon, wrote a letter to the Journal of American Medical Association. They pointed out that while social conditions unquestionably were a factor in provoking the riots, it was time to look at the individuals who were conspicuously violent. They should be clinically examined. The goal of such studies, they said, would be to pinpoint, diagnose, and treat those people with low violence thresholds before they contributed to further strategies. Mark, for one, has backtracked somewhat by pointing out that the police, too, are often to blame for violence during riots. But their letter was quoted in Ebony magazine in an article titled New Threat to Blacks, Brain Surgery to Control Behavior. At the Second International Congress of Psychosurgery in Copenhagen, M. Hunter Brown, a neurosurgeon from the Los Angeles area, proposed pilot programs for the precise rehabilitation of the violent prisoner patient. He hoped the state of California would provide programs that would include diagnosis, trial use of newer drugs, and finally, neurosurgical intervention to specific targets as indicated. Until then, humanity must mark time. A neurophysiologist, Robert Livingston of the University of California, San Diego, has called present penal systems self-defeating and has proposed proper intervention in the brains of prisoners who have temporal lobe defects. Around the world, thousands of operations are being performed each year on brains of unruly or deviant persons. A few of the surgeons profess to operate only or mainly on persons with clear evidence of organic abnormalities in the brain, such as epilepsy. It should be noted incidentally that it is the rare epileptic who is violent towards others during his seizures. If he is unruly at other times, it may be coincidental. A criminal who has been pistol whipped a few times may well develop a brain pathology. But in general, the evidence of any correlation between provable brain pathology and tendencies to violence is skimpy. Other surgeons say they are just trying to help people with tendencies to violence stay out of trouble. And some make no bones about the fact that whatever the condition of the brain, they are in favor of operating on it, primarily on the amygdala. Their aim is to help make individuals less troublesome for the people who want to or must manage them. The trouble can be as simple as that of a destructive, hard to manage child whose mothers seek help. Walter Freeman, sometimes called the dean of psychosurgeons, cited the case of a toy smashing 6-year-old who was a real problem to her mother. After 2 extensive lobotomies, he reported the child became quite withdrawn but less troublesome. Peter Breggin notes that the majority of the main psychosurgery operations performed by Orlando J. Andy, director of neurosurgery at the University of Mississippi, have been on children. They were classified as hyperactive, aggressive, or emotionally unstable. Breggin cited a letter from a psychologist working with Andy who stated that the operations on the children were to reduce hyperactivity to levels manageable by parents. More common, however, is the brain operation performed on people in institutions that make them easier for the custodians to manage. One of the largest groups in the world on which surgery of the amygdala has been performed to control aggression and hyperactivity is that operated on by V. Balasubramanian at the General Hospital in Madras, India. He has described the surgery as sedative neurosurgery, designed to make the patient quiet and manageable. Balasubramanian cites violent patients who could be safely left in the general wards after the operation. One formerly assaultive patient became helpful around the ward and even looked after other patients. Other surgeons have cited postoperative patients who were more willing to handle such as floor mopping, chores as floor mopping. Robert Neville has headed a task force formed by the Institute of Society, Ethics, and Life Sciences to study the full social impact of psychosurgery. He has concluded that psychosurgery has a dangerous attraction for institutions as the cheapest and easiest treatment to adopt for controlling patients. This attraction, he believes, raises the hazard that psychosurgery can be improperly used to subdue aggressive dissidents. Bergen puts the appeal more flatly. The situation poses a potentially disastrous situation for children in the state institutions or adults in state prisons. Both, he says, are entirely under the control of authorities whose major intention is to manage them in the most economical and most efficient manner. He cited in the congressional record medical reports by Walter Freeman, in which Freeman asserted that there is no compelling need to operate on a hospital patient. If the ward notes read, gives no trouble in the ward. In 1971, Freeman commented further that psychosurgery is the ideal operation for use in crowded state mental hospitals with a shortage of everything except patients. The appeal to law and order people of a quick surgical taming of unruly people is seen in the fact that the U.S. Department of Justice granted nearly $200,000 to the Neuro Research Foundation in Boston. The foundation was set up by Mark, Sweet, and Irvin. The money was to be spent in trying to identify violent prisoners who, in routine screening, might also appear to have brain disorders and thus presumably be candidates for psychosurgery. Recent criticism of psychosurgery on confined people, however, caused the Justice Department to beg off when Mark, Sweet, and Irvin asked that the fund be increased to $1.3 million. A number of state law enforcement agencies, particularly in California and Illinois, have shown themselves to be fascinated by the surgical approach to coping with unruly prisoners. In 1971, the Director of Corrections for California came up with a broad-scale proposal for neurosurgical treatment of violent inmates who seemed to test to brain disorders that might account for the violence. Stephen L. Corover of MIT came upon a portion of an official affidavit concerning one inmate who presumably would be considered a candidate. He was being transferred to the prison at Vacaville, California for psychiatric evaluation. The man was described as aggressively outspoken, always seeking recruits for his views that the institution and its staff were oppressing inmates. This man was teaching other inmates karate. He had been involved in work stoppage. He sought from the outside books attacking society. He set a fire to May to demonstrate his political views. In short, he appeared to be a strong-minded dissident. 3 years earlier, 3 inmates of the Vacaville Prison Hospital who had a history of violence agreed to have part of their amygdalas destroyed. The results were not particularly impressive. The one who showed the most initial improvement was paroled and was soon back in jail on a robbery charge. He complained that he had begun losing control of his emotions. It is undoubtedly true that surgery in parts of the deep limbic system, such as the amygdala, can dampen emotionality. But the techniques are still primitive. Furthermore, as indicated, there is an intricate interplay between the various states of the brain. Ayub Khan Maya as a research director of U.S. National Institute of Neurological Diseases and Stroke, testified that every part of the brain requires the other parts to function. We have relatively little knowledge of how digging around in one area discombobulates the whole brain system. Maya also expressed doubt that the presence of abnormal brain waves necessarily indicates structural damage in the brain. Early enthusiasts of psychosurgery cited substantial rates of brainwave abnormality in prison populations of evidence of brain damage. They did this without checking the brain waves of control group of non-incarcerated people. Many individuals who reveal brain wave abnormalities are not noticeably prone to any abnormal behavior. We have then with psychosurgery a new technology that was developed largely from humanitarian reasons, but it has become widely used in the world to make people more tractable, whether or not they behave in ways dangerous to others or themselves, and it has potential for manipulative control of man, including the elimination of dissenters. All this raises serious questions about when, if ever, it should be permitted. Peter Breggin has called for a total outlawing of all forms of psychosurgery as unjustifiable mutilation. A number of bills have been proposed in the United States Congress either to outlaw or restrain psychosurgery. One would impose a fine of $10,000 on any psychosurgery performed at federally financed institution. My feeling is that outlawing psychosurgery at this stage would be a bit drastic. A flat outlawing would void the humanitarian goal of offering hope or relief for some hopeless sick people willing to have anything done to ease their misery. As Henry K. Beecher, a Harvard anesthesiologist, put it, talk about civil liberties, it would seem that hope for relief is rather an important one. We are dealing, however, with a very imprecise and misused technology. We do not understand the functioning of the brain well enough. Far too little experimentation has been done on primates. One of the best primate studies now underway is the Yerkes Regional Primate Center at Atlanta, Georgia. I believe there should be a moratorium for 5 years on all psychosurgery on humans that does not meet stern criteria of diagnosis and supervision. Irreversible psychosurgery at this experimental stage should be not permitted on confined persons, even if they give consent, without exceptionally thorough independent review, since the coercive atmosphere makes truly informed, willing consent difficult to obtain. For example, refusal to volunteer might affect prisoners' chances of parole. This position that consent alone is not enough was upheld in 1973 by a judge panel in the Wayne County Circuit Court in Michigan. The case involved a prisoner with a long history of violence who had been selected for experimentation and had agreed to it. The judges became convinced during the lengthy testimony that the predictable effectiveness of psychosurgery for controlling violent conduct is unknown. The scientists do not know enough about brain structure to understand why the surgery should work, much less whether it might work in specific cases, and that this kind of surgery has the inevitable and irreversible effect of blunting the emotions. During the moratorium, no hospital in the nation should permit psychosurgery on anyone unless the case is first reviewed by a committee consisting of people not associated with the hospital. An advisory commission to the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare has recommended in 1976 that psychosurgery still be treated with an experimental procedure. Also, no operation should be permitted that is not clearly therapeutic, rather than manipulative in intent. Finally, a national registry of people identified only by code number who undergo or have been in the past decade undergone various kinds of psychosurgery should be started, and the records should include an evaluation of the results. This would provide researchers many of the answers we need to know before psychosurgery under tight regulation can be accepted as a standard permissible therapeutic procedure. Brain surgeons are usually too busy to make more than quick superficial checkups on patients whose brains they have intruded. For the present, people who are worried about their tendencies to be violent would, I feel, be better advised to take the pill route. This is usually not irreversible. There are the moderate tranquilizers. There are also specific anti-aggression drugs mentioned previously available in development. The absence of certain enzyme in males creates an excess of uric acid, which is known to cause hyperaggressiveness. Furthermore, there is lithium. Michael Sheard, a psychiatrist of Yale, tried it on 12 inmates in the Connecticut State Prison at Summers who had long histories of violent behavior. For 1 month, they took one lithium carbonate capsule every day. The next month, they unknowingly took placebo pills identical in the appearance and taste. The alteration went on for a number of months. She'd reported a notable reduction in violent behavior during the lithium periods and with no detectable serious side effects. Behavioral shapers other than surgeons have been actively promoting tractability in prisons. Re-enter the operant conditioners and brainwashers. Also enter the group therapists and drug manufacturers. A traditional way to cope with nonconforming prisoners was to put them in the hole on bread and water. In the 1950s, they gave way to a reformist ideal that no prisoner was beyond redemption and that all, even the worst, could be helped by psychological counseling. Individual talking out of problems, however, proved to be time consuming. Meanwhile, crime was increasing. The law and order people began calling for no nonsense approaches to handling prisoners. They talked more of management of prisoners, less of rehabilitating them. They became intrigued by a number of managing techniques coming out of the behavioral and medical sciences. Many prisons found that by use of such powerful tranquilizers as prolixin, they had their troublemakers walking around the yards like zombies. Prisoner at the Arizona State Prison wrote in the New York Times that he had seen electroshock treatments, usually reserved for treating depression, used to reduce the vigor and vitality of jailhouse lawyers and inmates considered to be political radicals by prison officials. Prisoners called it Edison medicine. There was blunt talk of brainwashing prisoners to soften them up for rehabilitation through an array of behavior modification strategies. A number of sources, including Jessica Mitford in her Kind and Usual Punishment, tells of a lecture of brainwashing given to a conference of wardens by an MIT psychologist. He had studied brainwashing techniques used on United States prisoners by Asian communists. In his lecture, he suggested that certain of the techniques might be used effectively in our prisons. According to Mitford, the wardens were urged especially to consider the systematic isolation of a target prisoner from his friends. The wardens were briefed on the promotion of mutual distrust achieved, to cite one method, by tricking the prisoner into writing statements that are then shown to the others. This was to convince him that he could trust no one. The wardens were also told about a concluding technique of putting the softened prisoner into a new, ambiguous situation in which he was confused by unclear standards. Then pressure was put on him to change in the directions desired. Mitford tells of evidence that this brainwashing approach had been put into effect in at least one federal penitentiary, the one at Marion, Illinois. Members of the Federal Prisoners Coalition smuggled out a detailed report of an alleged experimental program startlingly similar to that proposed to the wardens. It was applied primarily to troublemakers, and it was part of a personality restructuring program worked out by Martin Groter, the prison psychiatrist. He had become the Skinner of prisoner modification. A prisoner was harassed by the methods described above until he agreed to submit to Groter's thought reform program. Then he was subjected to intense pressure from a team of reformed prisoners. They probed his fears. They systematically attacked his whole framework of beliefs. The idea was to bring him under thought reform so that he could be reborn as highly probable winner in the game of life. Once reborn, he moved into plush quarters and became himself a member of an attack team against other prisoners still waiting to be reborn. Meanwhile, the operant conditioners, their briefcases bulging with aversive rewarding strategies for shaping behavior, began showing up in U.S. prisons. Many were wholly or partly supported by grants from U.S. Bureau of Prisons or from the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration of the U.S. Department of Justice. The LEAA was requested to provide a list of behavioral research projects it was supporting. In response, it provided a computer printout of 400 projects that might involve behavior modification. At a federal prison for women in Alderson, West Virginia, female inmates were operantly conditioned by being locked in a cell with only a bathrobe and chamber pot. This aversive therapy was to motivate them to earn their way to clothing, furniture, and normal prison life by exhibiting desired behavior. A more celebrated application of behavior modification occurred at Medical Center for Federal Prisoners at Springfield, Missouri. The program was designed to rehabilitate problem prisoners sent there involuntarily for treatment. Reportedly, some were not a problem because of the violence, but rather because of their cunning in organizing escapades to harass prison staff members. The conditioning strategy was cold turkey therapy with a promise of relief and rewards. On arrival, the participants were thrown into solitary confinement in dark, cramped cells, 6 by 10 feet, and deprived of privileges. Real aversive therapy. Each prisoner had to build up 20 consecutive good days before he could start enjoying the first of 3 levels of rewards. One prisoner disliked the game so much that he spent 42 days in total darkness, except for the exercise and showers. Prisoner compiled a good day by stopping the use of abusive language, by keeping his cell clean, and by observing all the rules. He was closely monitored by prison aides with checklists in hands. Within a year, it was hoped each participant would become an obedient citizen enjoying all available privileges. Then he would be returned to his home prison. He was to be inspired to progress by the title of the program, START, Special Treatment and Rehabilitative Training. START. Most behavior shapers believe that positive reinforcers produce better long-term effects than punishment, but in their dealings with prisoners, they found the subjects generally suspicious. Also, they found themselves working with obedience-minded wardens quick to order aversive treatment. Several newly developed drugs, it turned out, can have a more aversive effect than weeks spent in a solitary confinement. The drug apomorphine can cause uncontrolled vomiting for up to an hour. Even more motivating is an injection of a nectine, succinylcholine. It has been used extensively by researchers as aversive therapy in prisons at Vacaville and Atascadero, California. The drug is derived from South American arrow poison curare. A nectine takes the misbehaving inmate to death's door. It paralyzes his muscles for breathing. He is suffocating but fully conscious. It is during the suffocating phase that the therapist reminds him of his inappropriate behavior, and this kind of aversive therapy may be helpful in enabling him to behave more appropriately in the future. Once the terror-stricken prisoner seems to get to the point, the drug's effect is counteracted. In 1973 and 1974, some of the techniques and tools used for reshaping the behavior in prisoners came under attack. A court declared that the use of the vomiting drug in an Iowa prison is cruel and unusual punishment unless the inmate gives written consent. The American Civil Liberties Union won a court order ending some aspects of the Marion brainwashing program. The Federal Bureau of Prisons, faced with a lawsuit from inmates in congressional hearings, stopped its START program at Springfield. LEAA faced charges that federal police were getting into the mind-bending business and nervously announced that it would at least stop funds to support medically oriented program for systematic behavior modification. It was speculated that any half-right state administrator of prisons could still salvage LEA grants by renaming his programs. 6 months after the announcement, not a single behavior or biomedical research program had in fact been canceled. Their director of Bureau of Prisons made it immediately clear that although START was being dropped, the Bureau was still very much interested in the use of behavior modification. He saw it as an integral part of many prison programs. We're going to start programs in all our penitentiaries segregation units, he disclosed. Only they won't have titles that carry such emotion. Aversive therapy continued to flourish in state prisons, but in general, the name of the game now was change the name and ease up on the more blatantly coercive projects. Monitor, a bulletin of the American Psychological Association, reported a scramble among psychologists to dump the phrase behavior mod. It was getting all mixed up in the public's mind with psychosurgery, drugs, electroshocks, and coercion. One behavioral spokesman, Leonard Krasner, proposed environmental design or behavioral influence as a possible substitute for behavior mod. Other worthy synonyms mentioned in the report were behavior therapy, behavior shaping, social learning, and applied behavior analysis. Krasner criticized B.F. Skinner for persisting in using the word control. Skinner was reported to be opposed to dropping it. In his view, undertakers did little to alter their image by changing their job title to funeral director. The APA Monitor report concluded, perhaps the best that psychologists can do for the time being is to speak softly, and for heaven's sake, don't carry an electric cattle prod. However, by 1976, the APA was, as mentioned in Chapter 1, using the phrase behavioral control as a theme for master lecture series at its annual convention. By whatever name, the use of scientifically developed behavior modification techniques proceeded to go forward in at least a dozen penitentiaries. Officially, electroshock, aversive drugs, and like were taboo. Instead, a host of strategies were tried that sprang from the fertile mind of Martin Groder, the man who tried brainwashing at the Marion Penitentiary. An editor of Human Behavior reported that Groder called his overall approach Asklepion. He explained it as an intensive treatment community. It combines transactional analysis, gestalt therapy, primal scream therapy, psychodrama, and confrontations in marathon groups derived from Synanon games. None of these techniques involve behavior modification as practiced by operant conditioners. The main center where these Groder strategies were supposed to be tried was a somewhat mysterious federal installation near the backwoods village of Butner, North Carolina. The installation would cost more than $13.8 million. Groder was named the warden. Its experimental area for testing behavioral modification techniques was the house 200 inmates in relatively comfortable surroundings. There were to be no cells in the plan, just behavior modification units. Yet a number of prison associations around the country began protesting as in dread. Before the center finally opened in 1976, after delays, its name was changed twice. At first, it was to be called the United States Behavioral Research Center, then the Federal Center for Correctional Research. By the time it opened, it was simply named the Butner Federal Correctional Institution. By opening time, Groder, with his provocative ideas, had dropped out as warden. As at last reports, the behavioral research part of Butner, which houses 200 hardcore repeat offenders, was essentially voluntary. Brutality was out. The Bureau of Prison psychologists stated that the inmates are being offered a choice of programs, sort of like college catalog. The asserted aim now is to test a central behaviorist contention that environment shapes behavior. All this suggests that it may be possible for behavior modifiers under pressure from prisoner and libertarians to design useful programs. Many prisoners want a chance to feel better about themselves, and at least some want to help in improving their chance of going straight outside. If they are treated as responsible persons, the chances are at least greatly improved that they will respond responsibly. A first requirement, however, is that the goal to help the prisoner, not manage him more efficiently. A case in point is behavior of the inhabitants of a Denver facility known as the Cat House, CAT House. That is short for Colorado Closed Adolescent Treatment Center. There, the youngsters have been running their own behavior modification program with guidance from adults. Reports are that, for the most part, it has worked out well.